Hey, this is Terratoots with a quick introduction to applying procedural shading and populations to real-world terrain. In the previous video, we found and imported a digital elevation map of Mount St. Helens, cleaned up the data, and framed a nice shot. At the end of the video, I quickly showed some ideas for ground coloring in a forest, and I've had some requests to go through those steps in a little more detail. The first thing we're going to do is add a bit more detail to the terrain using the classic erosion add-on. The way I like to do this is to first lay down a simple shape shader to help mark where the erosion map is going to be. We'll do that by coming into Shaders, Add Layer, Color Shader, Simple Shape. Copy some coordinates off the center of the mountain here, paste those into the position, and we're going to make this about 10,000 meters by 10,000 meters to cover the entire terrain. Okay, that looks like it should be covering everything visible to the camera. Now, we add the erosion layer under Terrain, Displacement, Classic Erosion. We'll move the erosion map to the same place we put our simple shape shader, keep the height map size to 10,000. Let's increase this resolution. We don't want to change the terrain shape much, so we'll keep the erosion strength light and keep the rock softness a little higher. I'm also going to reduce downcutting. In the Render tab, we'll check Render Outer Terrain and Render Original Height Field Details. Now we can go ahead and erode. Next, we're going to add a lake. Looking at a map of Spirit Lake, the water comes right up to about the side of this hill. So we'll right-click, copy altitude, and add our lake with the water level at that same altitude. Next, we're going to turn on the Ray Traced Preview and add a new surface layer, which is going to be a dark green grass color. We'll reduce the coverage to 0.9 to let the base color show through just a bit, and increase the fractal breakup to 1. We're also going to add a power fractal as a color shader to give some variation to the green. We'll come to this and give it a larger scale, as well as set it to purlin ridges for some strand-like variations. Coming back to the surface layer, we'll add an altitude constraint partway up the mountain, and give it a pretty large fuzzy zone to fade the transition to rock. Next, we'll add a brown surface layer, which is going to be our dirt. We'll reduce the coverage of this one a bit to mix it better with the green, and increase the fractal breakup to 2. We'll also add a fractal color function. And the only thing I'm going to change here is to increase the roughness of the color to further break up the edges of the brown color. We'll set the max altitude for this color to about 1,000 and decrease the fuzzy zone to 50. The brown and green colors don't actually matter too much in this shot, since we'll be covering most of the area with trees in a minute, but they'll give something to look at for any spots that we leave uncovered. We'll finish the shading by adding some snow. Create another surface layer, and in this case we'll leave it at the default whitish gray to give it the feeling of dirty, partially melted snow. Bring the coverage down just a bit, and add some breakup. We'll set the minimum altitude to just around our tree line, with a large fuzzy fade. For this shader, we're going to add a max slope of 45 degrees with a fuzzy zone of 5. This will keep our snow off the cliffs and onto the gentler slopes, enhancing the melting look. Finally, we'll turn on Intersect Underlying, with it set to favor depressions, which will cause the snow to sink into the depressions, giving a nice look. Next up are trees. I'm going to be using a subalpine fir from Xfrog. We'll add the population, and then center it on the mountainside, making it large enough to cover the visible camera space. We'll reduce the spacing to make the trees pretty close together, and increase the spacing variation a bit for some more randomness. We'll also change the minimum and maximum scale for some size variation in the trees. We want to limit the trees to the edge of the lake at the bottom and partway up the mountain at the top. We'll do this by adding a distribution shader. With maximum and minimum altitude constraints. The lakeside constraint will be pretty sharp, while the maximum will be more gradual. Make sure to check Use Y to get a more accurate line at the lakeside. I'm also going to add a maximum slope constraint of 60 degrees with a 10-degree fuzzy zone to keep the trees off the steeper cliffs. We'll also bring the coverage down just a touch to thin the trees a little bit. Now we can go ahead and populate. Okay, last thing is going to be clouds. I'm going to add a layer of large altocumulus castellanus and change the model to TG 3.9.04, which gives rougher clouds. We'll bring the coverage down just a little bit and increase the cloud density for some thicker, more solid clouds. You can play with the random C to get something you like, but here's one I found earlier. Behind this, we'll add a high layer of cirrus clouds for a more complex sky. Now, all that's left to do is to bring the sun around and down for some dramatic lighting, and our Mount St. Helens is complete.